Hello, everybody. This is your hostess Flamingo right here, speaking to you all once again, and welcome back to another Magical Girl podcast. But before we start, there's something I started noticing about my podcast. Here's the thing. When it comes to my Magical Girl podcast, I try my best to find Magical Girl shows that are completed, or at least concluded itself when it comes to watching these shows. And for that matter, I start also realizing a lot of these shows are pretty old. Some of them are fairly recent, more than others, like, say, Gushing Over Magical Girls, but there's a reason why I bring this up to you. See, I made this podcast due to the fact that when it comes to the Magical Girl shows I cover on this year podcast, I want you all to bear in mind when I talk about these shows, I'm not talking about shows fairly recent, or at least shows that came out at this time period. The reason why I bring this up is because I didn't bring this up in my Shamanic Princess video, but here's a reason why I do that. See, there was a Magical Girl show that I was originally going to cover in April that just came out that time. But if you know anything about me, you know that I wouldn't do that. Mostly because if the show just started, I wouldn't want to talk about it until it actually concluded itself. This is made apparent because when you get right down to it, to Studio Pierrot's Limits, it's not surprising they would have Magical Girl shows, sure. But if you know anything about their repetition, then you would know it would take a while for their show to get out there. And considering that I don't want to talk about something that came out recently, I'm not going to talk about this anytime soon, or at least not at the moment. And you might say, well, you talked about Gushing Over Magical Girl back in January of this year, Flatme. You clearly did watch the show that came out a few years ago, so what's the difference there? The difference is that, at least with Gushing Over Magical Girls, I made it no secret that I'm not talking about that show anytime soon. And what's more is that if you've heard my voice in that video, then you would know how much that video made my voice tremble. Seriously, I felt like I was on a watch list from the police or the FBI, if I'm being honest. And the same could imply with a lot of other Magical Girl shows, for the record, that could be pretty long. See, when it comes to longer Magical Girl shows like Ojama Doremi or Sailor Moon or something like, I think, for example, Mermaid Melody, then chances are I pretty much already talked about those, and despite that it took me a while to finish Mermaid Melody, while the other two I have yet to finish, I actually watched a batch full of episodes in order to get a quick understanding of what the shows are like. So there's another show out there that I'm gonna have to wait until next year to talk about. See, the other show I wanted to talk about was Shugo Chara, but after looking up how many episodes there were, yeah, I'm not gonna do it this year, but maybe next year I'll talk about it. Especially for how long this show is, 120 episodes, which isn't as long as Sailor Moon Ojama Doremi is, but it's still long enough to realize that, yeah, I'm gonna have to hold that back a bit until further notice. But I do apologize in advance if it seems like I should be talking about shows at the moment anyways. But today, we're looking at a show that I unfortunately cannot find all of the episodes, but still want to work with what I got. That series being Magical Angel Sweet Mint. Yes, I finally got the name right this time. I'm sorry, it's just that every time I tried writing down the name for the script of the video, I kept fumbling every time I tried talking about this title. But without further ado, let's talk about that. Yeah, this is another show that I've actually wanted to talk about for a while. Up there with Cutie Honey Flash, this is another series that I've always wanted to talk about back in May of 2024 when I was starting out my podcast. And because I didn't really get to watch it in time during that period, I decided to look at it now of all things. But for some reason, I kept putting it off until I found out why. See, Magical Angel Sweet Mint is one of those shows that lasted for 47 episodes. But for some reason, every time I try looking up to see where I can find this show, the more obscure it became fine. Yeah, this is one of those cases where, unlike a lot of the Magical Girl shows I've covered on this podcast, this is one case where I couldn't find most of the episodes. I tried watching on a website where I do watch my Magical Girl shows anyways for this podcast, but unfortunately only had 9 episodes. I went on 9 Anime, which was the website that I remember watching, but if you've watched my Cutie Honey Flash video, then you already know that website already shut down back in April of this year of 2026. Rest in peace. But afterwards, I pretty much had to watch whatever I could out of this. They did create a playlist of all the episodes back then with all 47 episodes, but unfortunately they got taken down because if you know anything about YouTube, it's because copyright is a bit. And you might well say, why not to try the Internet Archive? After all, there's tons of old classic anime on there. Except, right as I was doing so, they didn't have the series on there. I tried it on YouTube once again, and the only episodes I could find are the ones that I found. Yeah, they did have some episodes that have subtitles in them, or at least an English fan sub, depending on who asked, but like I said, not all of the episodes are on there. I did take a double take to see if this was true or not, but unfortunately, the most you're gonna find are basically either DVD rips from clean copies that they found, and what's more, the only things they had in there what were openings, closing themes, and as well as have a person who talked about some of these episodes of what their favorites are, only in a minute or so in their length. So yeah, not a lot to work with when you have a series like this. Then again, I think I shouldn't be too surprised given that the studio behind it, Ashi Productions, has their limit of that, so what do I... If you're not familiar, Ashi Productions is known for having a lot of made-for-TV anime. They mostly have stuff like Magical Girl or something that come into the mecha genre, but beyond that, you're mostly gonna have some of them that mostly came from TV adaptation. As much as they can. Sure, on occasion you see something that came from a manga in of its own history, but only very little. Sure, on occasion you're going to find some stuff on there that might be your protocol. They did work on an Idol series and as well as the Zorro anime adaptation. Yes, as in the Legend of Zorro anime adaptation. Not to be confused with Zorro from One Piece. But after that, however, you're not going to find too many wide releases of these from old classic series back then. And to me, that's kind of the problem when it comes to Magical Sweet Mint. And you might well say, why not check the DVD out? Yeah, that's the thing. I would talk about the DVD if I had a DVD player, but another thing too is that Magical Angel Sweet Mint is also one of those shows that has mostly toy merchandise, which to me isn't that surprising given that Magical Girl shows are no limit on something like merchandise. Still, I feel like if anything, at least they actually sold the show, if anything, but those who have good memories, I'm surprised that they still managed to sell the toys despite the expensive prices. But as I said, even if we're not talking about the toys, we're talking about the anime. So I guess we'll have to look at whatever I could find, and hopefully you'll understand why I personally think this is one of the most important shows that need to be taken on. Anyways, so without further ado, let's talk about Magical Angel Sweet Mint and see what we've been... Our series begins with our main character, Mint, who is a princess that came from the magical world where anything possibly could happen with magic. Along with her penguin friend, Waffle, they both seem to be in the magical kingdom together. However, one day when they were going to visit the flower garden, it's here where we see that the flowers themselves have turned black, which I'm not so sure if they look black because when I watched the series for myself, they look more navy blue, but that's probably just me going colorblind or maybe I think it was something else. Anyways, Mint here, however, is pretty discerned by this, so much so that she wonders what happened to the flowers with their colors and everything. See, the flowers themselves don't just come out of thin air by saying they bring colors to the magic world. They usually have humans bring their happiness to make their flowers all unique of what it is anyways. But while trying to use her magic, she was stopped by someone because magic itself can cause a little bit of harm to it. So with this, it really backfires tremendously of itself when she actually can't try it for herself. One day after her going to the kingdom to meet up with her father, she has to go to the human world to meet her Aunt Herb to the happy shop, except not taking the map when going along with that. Well, I guess that's why they call you a bumbling king, but still. But after finally getting into the shop in of itself, however, it's here where we see that she has her new friends, a boy named Plum and a girl named Nuts. Yeah, I took a double take on that because I thought at first that Nuts was the boy and Plum was a girl, and that was a complete 180 on my part, but knowing that they say Nuts for boys and something like that, I'm glad they took that away from that, if anything. And later on, Takuda, who, while he is a little boy that goes to the shop every now and then, despite a stubborn attitude. He later joins in with the kids as well, because as of he's joining the happy shop in order to make sure that customers are all happy themselves with whatever situation they pass. So immediately for a premise like this, it does sound to me that I thought at first it would be a story series with something to learn about how to shop, if anything. But while the shop is there, I'm not going to mince words and say that it's always like that. See, this series is in a lot of ways episodic, at least what episodes I've seen of it so far. But that also raises to a lot of things that I need to point out with you people. See, I did say that this series in of itself is one of those series that you could argue that it's one of those cases where, despite coming out before Sailor Moon, like I said in my community post, it should be worth noting that it's also one of the more overlooked ones. See, I said that in my community post this came out before Sailor Moon, and I wasn't kidding. This came out in 1990, whereas Sailor Moon came out in 1992. But despite being an episodic series, instead of having a more story-driven feel to it, I'm guessing this is just like how any show was back then. Instead of having a Monster of the Week show, this is kind of a lesson of... Okay, I know that some people are going to be a little flustered when I say this, but can I just say for the record, I don't mind episodic shows, especially when it comes to this genre in particular. Yeah, I know that some people are going to say to me that it feels redundant, especially because nowadays, more than ever before, story-driven shows seem to appeal more of a much wider audience than it does for an episodic show. And while I am aware there are episodic shows every now and then, especially these days, you don't have to do a story-driven series, it goes without saying that even you can at least point out to yourself that this is still one of those shows that has that feel to it. But you might be wondering, why did I say that this was one of the other important shows out there? After all, it sounds like any other Magical Girl show that came out before Sailor Moon came to the picture, or at least it's not like any other show. Why is that? Well, that's because... Hear me out, because I know that some people are going to find this as a tangent, but it does require what you need to understand. See, I hear a lot of people say that there's always going to be a Sailor Moon ripoff, when in reality that's not always true. But with this show, however, I feel like it's best for me to say that just because Sailor Moon came out in 1992 does not mean it's the only one. I discussed this with someone back then, and in a few days or a few weeks ago, and let me tell you, whenever someone brings up that Sailor Moon's the only Magical Girl show out there, I'm putting my flamingo flipper down, because this is just ridiculous, and there's so many cases that I really need to at least discuss right now. You can call me an arrogant prick all you want, but I need to at least name something right here. See, Magical Angel Sweet Mint, while it did come out before Sailor Moon, it's one of those shows that you have to understand that, if anything, it's one of those shows that actually got overshadowed. And I wouldn't blame people if they didn't know about this show, because did you really expect anyone to know about this show beforehand? I'm not expecting everyone to know every Magical Girl show out there in existence, or anything that came out say, oh, let's know every genre's own history with this show or this movie. No. What I'm saying is that just because you yourself find the genre more popular at one part of that doesn't mean it's going to be unpopular with some other shows beforehand. Let me put it to you like this. Magical Angel Sweet Mint came out in 1990, so clearly the show itself came out before Sailor Moon came to the picture. But even taking that in, it also bothers me when some people will just automatically assume that just because a show that you tend to enjoy means that, oh, you really think that it's ripping off, even though if you did your own homework, you would know this is not always true. And let me just say for the record, this is Ashi Productions. Ashi Productions was known for having a lot of Magical Girl shows to the picture before Toei got Sailor Moon's own right to make an adaptation. And let me tell you again, this was made for TV. But I think the other reason why some people don't seem to remember, or at least don't know about this show, is because of how many episodes I was able to find. I checked, and the most I can find, at least for right now, were 19. Going back to what I said, it's 47 episodes long. And I know that some people are going to say that Wikipedia in of itself can be really resourceful when it comes to some kind of image when it comes to researching for this kind of stuff. But even I'll admit, just because you can find a lot of sources for it doesn't mean all of it's going to be accurate all the time. Some stuff is just inaccurate, other stuff will put something inconsistent, and I wouldn't blame people if they went back and forth and find out what was true and what was not. Sometimes sources can be hard to find these days. Then again, knowing how AI is always taking over the internet, because why the hell not anyway, apparently, I think that could have easily been what it is. But I don't want to say this too much on the series in of itself anyways, because I still think this is one of the other important shows out there. Much like Princess Comet, it's not just slice of life, it does really seem like it's a lesson of the week, which can be one or the other for quite some time, but I actually don't mind any of these characters, Mint especially, despite looking like Hatsumi before Hatsumi. It's actually one of those cases where I have to admit that she actually is pretty sweet in her own way, fitting given her name, but she also happens to have this little penguin named Waffle, and I gotta say, having a little flying penguin by your side is just really cute, if anything. And yes, before you ask, he does have a pouch inside his tummy, and I have to fully admit, that's actually really pretty nice in his own hindsight. I mean, aside from the nice, sweet nature these two have with each other, I couldn't find any other if there's episodes where there's conflict between these two, but I don't think it needs to. I mean, sure, here, you could say that Waffle himself could be just a mascot, but he doesn't really talk. All he says is bing 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 every time he says something, but really, I don't mind a mascot that doesn't talk, if anything. Saint Tail had a hedgehog that doesn't talk, and honestly, I'm okay with that if I'm being reasonable. But we also have the other characters who are also been sent human friends from the human world, those being Plum and Nuts. Plum is this boy who, for the record, I thought at first he would be that edgy teenage boy at times, but he also does seem to have a very supporting nature, though he did find Min Q, which I'm just gonna leave it up to my audience if you find that adorable or anything, because I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I'm not gonna be one of those people who find that cute, if anything. But we also have Nuts here, who, for the record, despite her name, she's also very kind and gentle and very supportive. And for the record, she seems to be very patient at times anyways. I won't lie, when I first saw this show, I thought at first that Mint and Nuts would have some sort of rivalry to it, but thankfully they never did that. Like I said, the series is lighthearted, if anything. It's not like there's going to be any conflict with the other human characters. Are there? Oh yeah, I forgot, but let's talk about the other two characters. But we also got Takuto's right here, and while I admit that he can be a bit stubborn at times, I'm not gonna really hold that against him because, well, come on, he's a kid. Did you really expect him to be all carefree, if anything? Jokes aside, however, I do kind of like Takuta, even if in spite of his own personality and everything. And while I admit that it does take him a while to join in, if anything, he appears in the shop in every episode because he does find out that the happy shop has its moments where it doesn't feel all that too happy, if anything. But he does seem like he's hooked up to the idea as time goes on, so props to him for getting character development. But we also have Herb, who is, like I said, Mint's aunt. And this may be the second time where I see a Magical Girl's aunt that's living in the human world, if I'm being honest. The first one would have to be Princess Comet, where Comet herself sees her own aunt, if anything. But that being said, I will say that Herb, despite her own tendencies, is actually very supportive of anything. She also teaches the kids about stuff, if anything, and mostly around Mint, because despite Mint being very naive, Herb is usually there to help her out and everything like that, even when there's also situations around stuff like this. But while there is some magic here and there, the magic itself is not always the main focus, despite the whole thing. However, yeah, some people could have a problem with that, but personally it actually gives a little more flavor to the characters of saying that there's more to them than just magic. Though, admittedly, the only ones who do magic around there are, like I said, Mint and Herb. So it's not like Nuts, Plum, or Takud are going to do so already. I guess to some extent Waffle could be a little bit like that, but whatever episodes I can find, I couldn't really tell if they did or not. And that's not me being lazy, people. That's just me telling you that I had a hard time finding whatever I could out of this year's show. But I have to say, for a series like this, there are some things that really did intrigue me as well, like Mint's compact. I mean, it is a magical girl show, so naturally, of course, the magical girl herself has to have something to, at least transform. Ain't that right, magical girl fans out there? Whoever's there in my audience, but still, her compact bracelet usually transforms only into two things before it goes back to being a bracelet again. But still, I love this thing. Maybe it's because I'm a little biased because I always used to pretend that my watch would always be one of those cases where I try to pretend it's a magical girl thing. Though, admittedly, I'm gonna have to get a new one because the other one broke. But that's beside the point, anyways. But yeah, it turns into one of those things would have to be a wand, which is nothing new, but still pretty enjoyable. Seriously, when it glows, I saw this one toy on YouTube in of itself years ago, and I still watch it sometimes where the toy itself can glow whenever the dial is switched over to whatever it is. Like if it's dialed to green, it would turn to like green. Whenever it gets turned to red, it turns into red. And whenever it turns into yellow, it goes into yellow. It's actually pretty cool, but you can see on screen it gets instantly pink. Though I think that has to be somewhat of the same difference because let's be real here. Pink and red are somewhat of the same color, aren't they? But it also transforms into this bow and arrow, which I'm not gonna mince words here with you. You know, I'm starting to realize I should stop saying that, but still. Whenever I hear about a bow and arrow used in a magical girl show, I'm immediately thinking of two things. Akuzuka and Cha-Cha with her bow and arrow, which, yeah, like I said, magical girl shows came out in the 1990s where the peak year may have came, but this came out in 1994, so write that off what you will. And Mint from Tokyo Mew Mew with her bow and arrow. But I don't know if you can find that. That's intentional or not, but I'm just gonna come out and say it, so why the hell not? Coincidence? I think not! I'm sorry if it seems like I'm not discussing a whole lot about what the show is like, despite this episodic nature and despite the feel to it, but really, when you watch a show like this, it does feel kind of sad that this show really got overshadowed by a lot of people, and it never got a full release anywhere. And I don't mean that I feel bad that it never got the recognition it did, although I feel like that is one of those cases, but I also pity for how much I really do pity this show more than I did. The more I watch this show, I start realizing I pity this show more than anything else I've ever come across my channel. Sure, I've talked about other obscure magical girl shows, but at least those had all the episodes I could devour down, if I'm being honest. This show, however, it just feels more like the public either ignored it unfairly, or the fact that some people just never gave it the time of day anyways. Whether you think of Mint and Friends is up to you, but if anything, I still believe that just because as the show came out before Sailor Moon doesn't mean that we should overlook it in a lot of ways anyway. And I realize that my podcast is not going to hit with everyone out there in my audience. I realize that. But there is something valuable that I have to at least say when it comes to this show in particular. You've already heard my spiel about why I made this podcast to begin with, but if I have to be completely honest, when it's something like Magical Girl shows that don't get as much recognition, that's probably why I also made this podcast to begin with anyways. There are just some Magical Girl shows that never got the time of day anyways. And it's surprising that someone like Dora Maney didn't take a look at this show because she talks about Magical Girl content as well. I'm sure that there are some people who want this show to get more recognition for those who have seen it and see the time of. But what do I know? I guess that's why my podcast is just there, I guess. It's just a pity that my only time when I do this podcast, it's only what it is. And that's why this video took as long as it did, if I'm being honest. Speaking of which, I really feel pretty bad that this summer hasn't been too many uploads for y'all anyway. But if there's one thing I can give to my podcast is that I do seem to see a lot more people tuning in whenever they do want to see more of this podcast anytime sooner. It looks like when you look at it. That being said, I'm not going to guarantee you my podcast is anything spectacular because that's really what I'm not here for. I'm not here to spread my ego. I'm not here to shame on people for not liking the podcast or anything. My viewings are open if you want to see them. And to me, that's what Magical Angel Sweet Mint is to me. Another obscure series that never got the light of day, and if it ever does get released, I like to see where the series ended, if anything, to judge by. But until then, I see you all in the next video. That will be my 7-year anniversary of this channel. So until then, I thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next time, and as always, stay flamingo-tastic. I'll see you all around.